Alex's voice cut through the clatter of dishes like a sharp knife. "Alara, bring me some tea now," he demanded. I paused, my hands submerged in soapy water. "Hold on, I'm doing the dishes," I replied. His tone was incredulous, laced with impatience. "Stop that and bring me the tea quickly. Can't you follow simple orders?" But I started only to be interrupted. "What a useless wife you are. Make me some sweet coffee, please." Mrs. Whitmore, my mother-in-law, spoke from the living room. She sat there devouring a slice of cake she'd taken from the fridge, her eyes glinting with malice. I sighed, glancing at the mountain of dishes. There are so many. Leave them for later. Just do what we say, useless wife. Alex's voice was a whip, each word stinging. I was Alara, a 28-year-old working mother trapped in a life that felt more like a prison than a home. Married at 23. I had hoped for love and companionship. Instead, I found myself in the clutches of Alex and his overbearing mother. Our son, only 4, was the sole source of joy in my bleak world. We lived in Alex's parents' house, a decision forced upon me under the guise of caring for Mrs. Whitmore after my father-in-law's passing. Initially, I sympathized with her supposed grief, but soon it became clear that I was nothing more than a pawn in her cruel game of domestic tyranny. Cooking, cleaning, working. It was never enough. My efforts were met with scorn, my meals left untouched or criticized harshly. "The stir-fry is so half-hearted," Mrs. Whitmore would scoff. "Cook it properly from scratch." "I'm busy and can only make simple things," I'd respond, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's why I hate back talk from a daughter-in-law," she'd snap. "Cook from scratch. Why don't you cook then? You're a good cook, right?" I dared to retort once, immediately regretting it. "Why would I do housework when you're here?" Her response was cold, dismissive. "Are you out of your mind?" Their cruelty escalated over time, shifting from harsh words to a chilling silence. They began to ignore me completely, as if I were a ghost haunting my own home. My presence, once merely undervalued, now seemed entirely invisible. 5 years passed in this suffocating atmosphere. Alex and I turned 35 and 33 respectively. Our son grew, yet the oppressive air in the house remained unchanged. My mother-in-law, now 63, seemed to thrive on my misery. One evening, as I trudged home from work, a heavy realization settled over me. My existence seemed pointless in their eyes. I was a shadow, unseen and unheard. The only voice that acknowledged me was that of my son. The thought of losing even that small recognition was unbearable. Returning home, I began cooking immediately, trying to push away the gloom. I prepared mapo tofu, fried chicken, and a stir-fry with bell peppers and pork, hoping to bring some semblance of normalcy to our dinner. "Bring me the mayo," Alex commanded abruptly, breaking his long silence. "Sure, here you are," I replied, handing him the mayonnaise. His first words to me in ages were not of gratitude or conversation, but a mere order. It was the final straw, the breaking point of my patience and tolerance. The evening took a turn for the worse when Mrs. Whitmore demanded, "Clean the toilet." "What, now?" I was aghast. "Yes, now," she insisted, her voice dripping with venom. I snapped back, unable to contain my frustration. "Don't say such a thing while we're eating. It's nasty, just like your heart," I hissed. Our argument escalated quickly, with Alex interjecting, demanding I apologize to his mother. But I refused, standing my ground for the first time in years. The conflict reached its peak, and in that moment, a decision crystallized within me. I needed to escape this toxic environment, not just for my sake, but for my son's as well. I retreated to my room, my resolve hardening. I downloaded divorce papers, filled them out, and slammed them in front of Alex. His shock was palpable, but I felt nothing but cold determination. "I'm filing these," I declared, my voice steady as I stood there facing my husband's bewildered expression. I realized I had finally stepped out of the shadows. It was time to reclaim my life. The days following my declaration of divorce were a whirlwind of cold glares and biting remarks. But amidst this storm, I found an unfamiliar sense of liberation. One evening as I served dinner, Mrs. Whitmore looked at the meal with disdain. "You call this food? Even a child cooks better." I bit my tongue, focusing on my son's smiling face. "Eat up, sweetheart. I made your favorite tonight," I said. Alex chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, playing the perfect mother now, are we? What a joke." I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I kept my composure. "I'm just trying to make a nice dinner for our son," I said. Mrs. Whitmore snorted. "Don't act high and mighty. You're just a burden in this house." The tension at the table was palpable. Alex's attempts to belittle me only intensified. "So, Alara, have you thought about how you'll survive after the divorce? You can barely keep a house, let alone your own life," he taunted. I looked him straight in the eye. "I have been supporting this family for years. I'm not worried about taking care of myself and our son." His smirk faded slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Mrs. Whitmore quickly intervened. "Don't be absurd. You need us more than we need you." The conversation turned to finances, a topic they usually avoided. "You do realize that without my salary, this household would crumble," I stated, more to myself than to them. Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. "We manage. We don't need your pity money." But Alex's silence spoke volumes. He knew the truth. Without my income, they would be in dire straits. In the following days, their behavior became increasingly erratic. Mrs. Whitmore oscillated between trying to sweet-talk me into staying and hurling insults when I didn't comply. Alex, on the other hand, seemed lost, his arrogant facade crumbling as the reality of his financial dependence became undeniable. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between them that chilled me to the bone. "She can't leave us like this," Alex hissed. "We need her money." Mrs. Whitmore's reply was cold and calculated. "Don't worry, I have a plan. We'll make her life so miserable she won't dare to leave." Hearing their true intentions laid bare was a revelation. They didn't care about me or even our son. It was all about control and money. That night, as I lay in bed, a plan began to form in my mind. If they wanted a battle, I would give them one, but it wouldn't be fought with words or petty arguments. I would hit them where it hurt the most, their pride and their pockets. The next morning, I started putting my plan into action. I contacted a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who came highly recommended. "I want a divorce," I told her, "and I want to make sure they don't get a penny more than they deserve." I told her, and she nodded, her eyes glinting with determination. "We'll make sure of that. You've been the sole breadwinner, right? We'll use that." As the days passed, my resolve only grew stronger. I started documenting everything, the insults, the financial manipulation, even the smallest of grievances. It was time to turn the tables, time for them to face the consequences of their actions. As I built my case, a sense of empowerment filled me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. The shadows of contempt were slowly lifting, and in their place, a new dawn was emerging. As the divorce proceedings began, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly toxic. Yet with each passing day, my sense of fear diminished, replaced by a steely resolve. One evening, Mrs. Whitmore tried a different tactic. "Alara, dear, why don't we forget all this nasty business? You know we're family." Her words dripped with insincerity. I met her gaze unwavering. "Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me." Alex, who had been quietly observing, scoffed. "Oh, playing the victim now? You're not as innocent as you pretend to be." I felt a surge of anger, but kept my voice calm. "I'm not playing anything, Alex. I'm just no longer willing to be your scapegoat." The conversation turned, as it often did, to finances. "You think you can just take our son and leave? How will you support him?" Alex challenged. I smiled, a small, confident curve of my lips. "I've been supporting this family for years. I think I can manage." Mrs. Whitmore's expression twisted into a sneer. "You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back." But their words no longer held power over me. I knew my worth, and I knew the truth. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. She laid out the strategy clearly. We'll expose their financial dependency on you. It will play a crucial role in the custody battle and the division of assets. I nodded, feeling a sense of vindication. The law was on my side, and I was ready to fight back. At home, the tension reached a boiling point. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to undermine me became more desperate. You think you're so smart, she spat one evening. But you're just a cold-hearted woman abandoning your family. I looked her straight in the eyes. No, I'm a woman who's finally standing up for herself, I declared. Alex jumped in, his voice laced with venom. You'll regret this. You can't survive without me. But his threats fell on deaf ears. I was done being intimidated. As the days went by, my preparations for the court battle intensified. I gathered financial statements, recorded their abusive remarks, and collected evidence of their negligence. One afternoon, as I was organizing my documents, my son came to me. Mom, are we going to be okay? His voice was small, uncertain. I pulled him into a hug, feeling a surge of protectiveness. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. We're leaving this place, and we're going to start a new, happy life, just you and me. His arms tightened around me, and in that moment, I knew I was making the right decision. I was fighting not just for myself, but for my son's future. The day of the court hearing loomed closer, and with it, a sense of impending freedom. I was ready to face Alex and Mrs. Whitmore, ready to end their reign of control and emotional abuse. I was ready to reclaim my life and give my son the peace and happiness he deserved. It was time for justice, and I was determined to see it served. The day of the court hearing arrived, a day I had been anticipating with a mix of dread and determination. As I sat across from Alex and Mrs. Whitmore in the courtroom, I felt a sense of surrealism. This was the moment where everything would change. The proceedings began with a cold formality. Alex's lawyer portrayed him as a devoted husband and father struggling under the weight of false accusations. Mrs. Whitmore played the part of the grieving mother-in-law wronged by an ungrateful daughter-in-law. But their performance was transparent, their lies brittle. When my turn came, I spoke clearly, my voice steady. I have been the sole provider for this family for years. My husband's employment and his mother's manipulation have been constant sources of strain. Alex interjected, his voice laced with false hurt. Alara, how can you say these things? I've always supported you. I turned to him, my gaze unwavering. Support is more than just words, Alex. It's about actions, and your actions have shown nothing but selfishness and cruelty. The judge listened intently as I presented my evidence. Financial statements, recordings of their verbal abuse, testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed their behavior. The truth was undeniable, and as the evidence mounted, Alex's facade began to crumble. Mrs. Whitmore's composure cracked, her mask of innocence slipping away. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Then came the revelation that sealed their fate. My lawyer presented photographs and documents proving Alex's infidelity and Mrs. Whitmore's illicit affair with a wealthy neighbor, Mr. Harwood. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the images were displayed, showing them in compromising positions, their deception laid bare for all to see. Alex's face turned ashen, his eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Whitmore's expression twisted into one of fury, her hands trembling. You invaded our privacy, Mrs. Whitmore shrieked, her voice shrill. I looked at her, my voice calm but firm. No, I exposed the truth, a truth that you both have been hiding for too long. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Their credibility was shattered, their lies exposed in the harsh light of the courtroom. As the hearing came to a close, the judge's verdict was clear. I was granted full custody of our son, and a fair division of assets was ordered. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were left with little more than their shattered reputations. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The years of manipulation and emotional abuse were finally over. I had stood up to my oppressors and emerged victorious. But the sweetest moment came when my son ran into my arms outside the courthouse, his face bright with relief and happiness. We did it, Mom, he said, his voice filled with joy. Yes, we did, I replied, holding him close. We're free now. It's just the beginning for us. And as we walked away hand in hand, I knew that this was not just a victory for me. It was a victory for every person who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, or unworthy. It was a victory for truth and justice. It was the start of a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope and the promise of a brighter future. The aftermath of the court ruling was immediate and tumultuous. Word of Alex and Mrs. Whitmore's deceit spread like wildfire, tarnishing their reputations in our small community. They were no longer able to hide behind their facade of respectability. In the days following the verdict, I focused on rebuilding my life with my son. But I couldn't ignore the sense of satisfaction that came from knowing Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were facing the consequences of their actions. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Mr. Harwood's wife, Mrs. Harwood, her eyes red with unshed tears. "Alara, I heard about everything. I can't believe what Sylvia, Mrs. Whitmore, did." Her voice broke, and I could see the pain etched on her face. I invited her in, offering a cup of tea. As we sat at the kitchen table, she poured out her heartache. "I trusted her as a neighbor, as a friend, and to think she was having an affair with my husband," she said. I listened, offering words of comfort. It was clear that Mrs. Whitmore's actions had caused more damage than she had ever anticipated. The next day, I encountered Alex in town. He was a shadow of the man he once was, his arrogance replaced by a look of defeat. "Alara, please, can we talk?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stopped, facing him. "What is there to talk about, Alex?" He fidgeted, unable to meet my eyes. "I am sorry for everything. I didn't realize how much I depended on you, on your strength." His apology, though late, was a testament to the shift in power. He had lost everything, his dignity, his home, his family. And in that loss, he had finally recognized his own faults. But it was Mrs. Whitmore who faced the harshest backlash. Her affair with Mr. Harwood had not only ruined her reputation, but had also led to legal troubles. Mrs. Harwood had filed for divorce and was pursuing a lawsuit against her for alienation of affection. I heard about Mrs. Whitmore's plight from neighbors, the whispers and rumors painting a picture of a woman undone by her own actions. One afternoon, I saw her at the grocery store, her eyes downcast as she hurried through the aisles. Our paths crossed, and for a moment, our eyes met. The look of resentment and defeat in her eyes was unmistakable. "You did this to me," she hissed under her breath as she passed by. I watched her go, feeling a mix of pity and vindication. "No, Sylvia, you did this to yourself," I whispered to myself. The tides of justice had turned, and the consequences of their actions were now inescapable. Alex and Mrs. Whitmore were living the life they had crafted through years of deceit and manipulation. And as I watched them struggle with the aftermath, I knew that the best revenge was living well, free from their toxic influence. As I turned my focus back to my son and our new life, I realized that this was not just a story of revenge. It was a story of liberation, of breaking free from the chains of abuse and control. And as I looked to the future, I knew that the best was yet to come.